yesterday. We appreciate you all being here today to discuss the Bureau-level details and priorities of the administration's fiscal year 2024 budget request. Among the three DOI bureaus, you manage most of the land in my home state of Idaho, and I'm well acquainted with the challenges you and your staff face on a daily basis protecting and conserving our national parks, wildlife refuges, and public lands. My colleagues and I hope to cover a lot of ground with you today. While I may not agree with all of the priorities in this budget proposal, I appreciate that we can have a productive conversation about the land management issues we are facing and the tools you need to manage our lands effectively and efficiently. Each of your fiscal year 2024 requests are for increases of hundreds of millions of dollars, including for initiatives like zero-emission vehicles. This year, more than ever, we must decipher between wants and needs. I have said this before, but it is important to repeat it. As the nation faces record inflation, we must be very conscious of our decisions on this committee to not saddle future generations with unnecessary economic burdens and further debt. The Republican Conference and the House Appropriations Committee have committed to taking meaningful steps to help put our country's fiscal house in order. In Idaho, it is difficult to think of land management without first thinking and foremost about threatened and endangered species. I commend the three of you for your cooperative approach you all are taking to conserve the sage grouse, though through collaboration with private landowners and investments in the state and federal lands. The sage grouse has not been listed. This is a huge win for conservation and should serve as a blueprint for other species. On the other end of the success spectrum, again this year, we are hearing about growing permitting backlogs for grazing and energy and mineral activities. There are continued population issues with wild horses and burros, which I'm sure that my colleague from Utah will bring up, and management activities that aren't hitting the mark. Many of my colleagues hear from their constituents about the increasing demand for access and recreation on our public lands. I could go on, but I feel our time would best be used with the conversations that we will have, so I look forward to working with you on many of these issues, and thank you for you and your staff for their hard work and assistance. At this time, I'll yield to Ranking Member Pingree for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Stone Manning, Director Williams, Director Sams, thank you for being with us this afternoon. We are pleased to talk with you today about the fiscal year 2024 budget request for your bureaus and to hear about your thoughts as managers of our country's national parks, national wildlife refuges, and public lands. I'm pleased to see that your budget requests build on the historic investments made in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act to improve the resilience of landscapes, reduce wildfire risks, support clean energy development on federal lands, and restore ecosystems. We know your bureaus have been challenged with staffing shortages as you work to deliver core programs and services to the American public and carry out your mission. I am pleased your budget requests include significant funding increases to strengthen your workforce and support these historic infrastructure investments. As we confront the challenges of species extinction, I am also pleased your requests include investments for species conservation and preserving biodiversity. These are essential if we are to protect our cultural and natural resources for present and future generations. I'm looking forward to our discussion today on how we continue to advance your missions and ensure that American families, communities, and economies can benefit from all our public lands have to offer. Thanks for being with us today. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Pingree. Director Stone Manning, we look forward to your testimony. You may proceed.
Chairman Simpson, Ranking Member Pingree, and members of the subcommittee, I'm Tracy Stone Manning, the Director of the Bureau of Land Management. It's nice to see you all, and it's nice to be here with my colleagues from the department. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the fiscal year 2024 budget priorities and the mission of the BLM. We're the nation's largest land manager, responsible for 1 in 10 acres in this country. The multiple use, sustained yield mission established by the Federal Land Policy and Management Act directs us to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of 245 million acres of public lands and 700 million acres of mineral estate for multiple uses. These lands provide food, fiber, minerals, energy, clean water, wildlife habitat, and lifetime memories for countless families. They are open to all. In fiscal year 2021, public lands managed by the BLM supported $201 billion in economic output and 783,000 jobs. Equally and vitally important is the work we do to conserve, protect, and restore public lands and nationally significant landscapes for the benefit of current and future generations. The President's fiscal year 2024 budget request of $1.7 billion for the BLM balances our responsibilities and advances the administration's priorities to address the climate crisis, accelerate responsible renewable energy development on public lands, create family-supporting union jobs, and strengthen diversity, equity, and inclusion in our work. The proposed budget emphasizes investments to improve the health and resilience of public lands from the stresses brought on by climate change, such as historic, widespread drought and wildland fires of increasing scope and intensity. That's why the budget requests $304.3 million for the BLM's land resources activity, which provides for management of forests, rangelands, and cultural resources, as well as wild horses and burros. As we transition to the clean energy economy, the remarkable solar, wind, and geothermal potential on our public lands can and must help meet Congress and the administration's goal of permitting 25 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2025. The budget reflects this priority by proposing $72.5 million in our renewable energy management program, an increase of 77%. I'm so pleased that the much-needed investments from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act will enable us to put people to work on public lands, restoring wildlife habitat and clean water, enabling us to leave these lands better off than we found them. Conservation is a key part of BLM's mission, with over 900 units of national conservation lands covering about 35 million acres, which includes national monuments and wilderness. These areas are also the current and ancestral homeland of tribal nations and indigenous peoples, many of whom have deep cultural and spiritual connections to these places. In addition, our neighbors across the country count on public lands managed by BLM as beloved recreation destinations. The ever-increasing interest in these lands requires additional support, and the budget request for the National Conservation Lands Program is $11.3 million above the 23 enacted. Throughout all of our work, we prioritize supporting the administration's efforts to create good-paying jobs and advance environmental justice, a priority that is emphasized in the budget request and in our programs to remediate and reclaim orphaned wells and abandoned mines. The budget also includes an increase of $12 million to help us establish and support the Youth Job Corps program, which will enable the BLM to employ young adults and veterans. Above all, the proposed budget reflects the administration's continued commitment to striking the right balance of land conservation and sustainable use of resources. It's incumbent on us as professional land managers to ensure that these activities are sustainable and beneficial to all Americans, regardless of where they live, and to future generations. We take this responsibility seriously. I take this responsibility seriously. I look forward to working with the subcommittee to provide us with the tools and resources necessary to achieve these important objectives. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you. Thank you for that testimony. Director Williams, you may proceed with your statement.
Good morning, Chairman Simpson and Ranking Member Pingree and members of the subcommittee. I am Martha Williams, Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm honored to join my colleagues today from the Park Service and the BLM, and I'm honored to serve alongside them. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the service's fiscal year 2024 budget request. The service collaborates with partners across the country to fulfill our mission of working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. Working with others is our identity. We're not the biggest agency. You might say we are a small fish in a big sea, but our strength lies in the relationships we build with states, tribes, and local partners that help us leverage conservation to make a difference in communities all over the country. We know we must connect with people and connect people to nature so that every day, every one of us can benefit from clean air, clean water, thriving wildlife populations, and the functioning habitat they depend on, access to the outdoors, and no matter where you are or where you live. And know also that it matters for our well-being, for our businesses, and for our communities. I know you are all familiar with our work, but few know the breadth of it. The Fish and Wildlife Service works with partners, states, tribes, sister federal agencies, and local governments through all of our programs, whether ecological services, the National Wildlife Refuge System, migratory birds, fisheries and aquatic conservation, the Office of Law Enforcement, International Affairs, Communications, the National Conservation Training Center, the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program, Technology and Administration. We use grant programs, provide technical assistance, join migratory bird flyway councils, work with communities to design fish passages, deliver urban wildlife conservation, stock and conserve fish, make sure that iconic species that we all know and love, and even the crazy little and unsung species that you may not have heard of, are here into the future. We serve the public through fighting fires, providing law enforcement for refuges, and as backup when needed and called upon by other partners, or provide visitor services, and so much more. The key is that we always do this with others. We support our partners' efforts to protect wildlife habitat, conserve wildlife species, ensure sustainable hunting, educate the next generation of hunters, improve local docks and marinas, and contain the spread of invasive species. We also work with private landowners across the country with our Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program, Migratory Bird Joint Ventures, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, and others, providing technical and financial assistance to landowners as they work to conserve wildlife habitat on their private lands. It's also essential for us to build and maintain government-to-government relationships with tribes. We are following the Secretary's leadership to pursue co-stewardship of the lands, wildlife, and fish that are a cornerstone of their culture. One example of leveraging money and impact is our Fish Passage program, through which we've collaborated with conservation groups and local stakeholders to remove over 3,400 barriers to fish passage at dams, culverts, streams, and other sites to ensure that we have healthier fish populations, reduced erosion, and cleaner water. Building on this ongoing effort, in July, we co-sponsored a National Fish Passage Infrastructure Law workshop with more than 100 partners from state agencies, tribes, NGOs, and other federal agencies. So far, the bipartisan infrastructure law funding has supported 184 fish passage projects coordinated across 5 federal agencies for a total of $259 million. This is the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act. We are making progress in protecting, recovering, and delisting species. 2 months ago, in partnership with the Department of the Defense, we delisted the San Clemente Bell's sparrow, one of the species you may not have heard of, and 4 other species. Because of the work we can do through our partnerships, hundreds of species are stable, recovering, or recovered, from the Louisiana black bear to the Aleutian Canada goose. At the service, we are incredibly grateful for the bipartisan infrastructure law and how it has proven to be a catalyst for conservation. This past year, the service used $111 million of bill funding to support our over 300 projects across the country, from improving water quality in the Delaware River Basin, to aquatic invasive species control around Lake Tahoe, to restoration and fish hatchery innovation in the Klamath, to capping orphan oil and gas wells in Louisiana and Oklahoma. the service is putting bill funding to work across the country. Creating and supporting these partnerships and projects requires a talented and dedicated workforce. The Fish and Wildlife Services employees are our greatest asset. They manage habitat on refuges, produce healthy fish at hatcheries, take care of our amazing national wildlife refuges, and when doing so, I must say, our maintenance professionals, I feel like they can fix anything. They work with project proponents in ecological services, field offices, and help them comply with the Endangered Species Act to get projects through, always in a hurry. And they conserve species internationally, put their lives on the line in law enforcement and fighting fires, and do so much more. To support the service's capacity to expand these partnerships, the administration is proposing a budget of $2.2 billion to fund the service's resource management and conservation programs, an increase of $315 million. These increases address the service's need for additional capacity, workforce capacity to work more quickly and thoroughly to review development projects, to expand hunting and fishing opportunities, to keep our visitors engaged and safe. We need to invest in these important goals, and I'll touch a little bit on what building our capacity can do. The service. Quickly. Yes, the Ecological Service Program helps bring species back to recovery, protect species. The budget request proposes an $88.5 million increase, which will help right-size our workforce. Our budget also includes a roughly $30 million increase for the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program to support collaborative efforts that improve habitat and keep working lands working. We will also invest $3 million in connecting wildlife corridors to allow species to move across the landscape. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. If enacted, this budget will make a significant difference in our ability to conserve natural resources in partnership with others for the benefit of all Americans. Thank you.
Last but certainly not least, we have Director Sims from the National Park Service, or Sands, I mean. You may proceed with your opening statement, and all three of your officials' submitted testimony will be included in the record.
Chairman Simpson, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you on the fiscal year 2024 budget request for the National Park Service. I also feel very privileged to be joining my sister bureau directors from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and BLM to appear before you today. I would like to summarize my testimony and submit my entire statement for the record. I want to begin by thanking Chairman Simpson and Ranking Member Pingree for our recent visits. I appreciate the opportunity to hear your priorities and was pleased that so many of our goals align for the future of our parks and our dedicated employees. I also want to thank the subcommittee for your support of the National Park Service in fiscal year 2023. Over the past year, I have visited parks across the country and seen firsthand some of the challenges they are facing, like recovery from natural disasters, adapting to increased or changing visitation, and the need to expand the breadth of the stories we are telling. I've also seen and heard from our employees about how much recent funding increases through fiscal year 2023's appropriations, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Great American Outdoor Act are making an impact. I thank you for your support, and I am pleased to share with you how our fiscal year 2024 budget will support that continued progress. The discretionary budget request for the National Park Service is $3.8 billion, an increase of $289.2 million compared to fiscal year 2023 enacted funding. I want to highlight a few components with you: conservation, racial justice, capacity, and housing. Our request proposes an additional $110.7 million in service-wide investments to protect resources from 21st century threats. Fundamental to this effort is an $86.8 million increase in operational funding to enhance natural resource capacity, expand youth corps programs that support conservation, and improve climate risk assessments and responses for our cultural resources. We also propose installing additional charging infrastructure to support the transition to zero-emission vehicles, complete climate vulnerability assessments, and better position the agency to respond to natural disasters. The fiscal year 2024 budget proposes $32.3 million in increased investments to advance racial justice and equity for underserved communities, including strengthening our nation-to-nation relationship with tribes. The budget supports an additional $7.1 million for expanded tribal co-stewardship of park resources, $2.5 million to increase tourism that benefits tribes, $2.5 million in dedicated funding for tribal heritage grants, and $1 million for management of subsistence uses of NPS lands and waters in Alaska. The initiative also supports funds to improve physical and programmatic accessibility and invests in new parks like the new Philadelphia National Historic Site and Blackwell School National Historic Site. The fiscal year 2024 request also invests in our employees. The National Park Service has lost almost 19% of our operations capacity since 2011. Over the same period, over 30 units have been added to the National Park system, and annual visitation has increased by more than 30 million. To help meet this demand, the budget seeks $25.4 million to support an additional 170 full-time employees. This increase will address new and critical responsibilities across the parks and bolster the U.S. Park Police and Special Agents Program. Lastly, the budget proposes an increase of $7 million to construct, improve, and modernize housing for our employees, which remains a critical issue at parks with insufficient available or affordable housing nearby. Finally, I am pleased to update you on the progress to implement the Great American Outdoors Act. Funding from the Legacy Restoration Fund has provided us almost $3.9 billion for deferred maintenance. We have obligated more than $1.4 billion, with over 70 projects underway and more starting this year. From the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the National Park Service has received nearly $300 million for the land acquisition activities and over $1 billion for state grant programs matched by non-federal funds for a total of impact of at least $2 billion. Chairman, this concludes my summary, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for your continued support of the National Park Service. I'd be happy to answer any and all your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Director Stone Manning, you probably anticipating a little question about Lava Ridge. In fact, several of them on here, but Magic Valley Energy has proposed the Lava Ridge Wind Project, a 400-unit wind turbine field on 73,000 acres of BLM property adjacent to the Minidoka National Historic Site, 25 miles northeast of Twin Falls, Idaho. If built, it would be one of the largest in the United States. The proposed turbines would stand at 740 feet tall. To put it in perspective, that height is greater than the Washington Monument or the Seattle Space Needle, with each turbine being comparable to the length of a Boeing 747. It's safe to say that if approved, the Lava Ridge Wind Project will forever change the landscape in southern Idaho. Affected farmers, ranchers, tribes, Japanese American community, and sportsmen have voiced legitimate objections. As it stands today, the local community predominantly has not shown support for this development. In fact, no one has called me and said they support this. This project is part of a greater initiative related to renewable energy, and the Magic Valley seems to be the target for these developments. I find myself questioning at this point, will the pressure to increase renewable energy trump the impacts to species and cultural sites? Question. How would the operation of these turbines and the assorted towers located affect birds of prey and avian populations such as sage grouse?
Chairman Simpson, thank you for the question. And as you know, as the whole subcommittee knows, we're working hard to meet Congress's request that we get 25 gigawatts of renewable energy and the President's request that we get 25 gigawatts of renewable energy onto our public lands by 2025. And we're working hard on the Lava Ridge proposal, listening carefully to your constituents on the ground. And I hope you see that we heard a bunch of the concerns with the draft preferred alternatives that are currently the source of much public conversation and a public comment period. It's a terrific example about how we all work together. I've worked with Director Sams and his team and Director Williams and her teams on digging in and making sure that we preserve the desolate feel at the Minidoka site so people understand what it was like to be interred there. And some of the changes you saw in the draft were because of sage grouse. And we're also looking at the bird of prey issue, and we'll continue to refine that work before the final comes out.
Thank you. And I will say that the hearing they held down, the BLM held down in Twin Falls, was very well attended, and I thought it was very respectful both by BLM and by the people that were there.
Yeah, glad to hear that.
How would project construction, operation, and maintenance affect available livestock forage and subsequent active grazing permits?
Yeah, thanks for that question as well, Chair Simpson. It's my understanding that we're working with the permittees now on how the company is working with the permittees on how those disruptions could be made up for in an equitable way. But ultimately, you can have cattle grazing and wind development in the same spot. I understand that the construction is a real issue, but ultimately the two can coincide.
What's the rough timeline for a decision to be made on large-scale wind and solar energy projects proposed on Bureau of Land Management land? And I understand, as we've talked about this when you were in my office, that valley is kind of a target because there's going to be many different proposed wind turbines and stuff in there because of its location and the wind that goes through there. And actually, it's not that the wind blows in Idaho, it's that Utah sucks, is what we've, no. That was a joke for years and years in Idaho, and I'm glad Stuart left before I said that. No. Anyway, could you remember the question now?
I can, I think. What are the timelines? So we are currently at Lava Ridge. We're currently right in the middle of the NEPA process. We extended the comment period to the end of this week, as I think you know, or actually into April. And it depends on the amount of comments that we get and the substance of those comments for how long it's going to take us to really properly incorporate them into our final. But I expect something by this fall or this winter. And you're right, those proposals are coming because there's a transmission line slated there that was congressionally mandated, and the projects are going to follow those lines.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I want to ask one more question before my time is up. Last week I had the BLM Idaho in my district office, or my DC office. One of the initiatives I was interested in learning about that I'd never heard about before was the testing of virtual fencing for grazing animal plots. Could you share with us the extent to which virtual fencing has been plotted in the United States, and are there potential cost savings associated with transition to this? And I understand they're doing some of that in Colorado. Fascinating.
Chairman Simpson, we are in the middle of pilot projects in Colorado, and I think we might be in one in Idaho, and I'll double check on that for you. I'm really excited about this technology. Barbed wire helped settle the West, but we don't necessarily need it anymore now that satellites can literally help guide where cattle go. And it'll help us, I think, get really smart about rotational grazing in a really thoughtful way that is going to help us get through some of these issues on the landscape because of climate change. So we're working with our partners, permittees, through pilot projects now, and I hope that it grows.
Thank you. Ms. Pingree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your testimony. It's good to have a chance to speak with all of you, and I appreciate so much the work that you do. In a recent response to a request from our committee, Secretary Holland, who was here earlier, provided a letter that highlighted some of the difficult cuts that might be faced if we were to return to fiscal 2022 year funding levels. So could you each just talk briefly about what you think the impact would be in your department? Maybe we start with Director Williams and just go through.
Thank you, Ranking Member Pingree. Returning to the 2022 funding levels would be devastating for the Fish and Wildlife Service for a number of reasons. First off, for our national wildlife refuges, where we are already, we have 800 fewer staff than we did in 2013. We have 309 unstaffed refuges. Wow. So to have those cuts would be very difficult to provide the services that I think the communities who hold refuges dear look to use those refuges for. In addition, the Endangered Species Act requires for projects undertaken by other federal agencies, we are required to do Section 7 consultation on those projects, and we have had an over 30% increase in project reviews, and I'm afraid we would become a bottleneck, and we would slow those projects down from getting delivered on the ground. And so we would have to make employee cuts for that instead of being able to ramp up to meet that growing need. So those are two very specific examples, but it would be difficult for the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you for that. We just had the EPA director and talking about the consultation on pesticide review, and I know that's already a bottleneck, so we don't want to increase that, so.
Thank you,
Director
Congresswoman.
Sams.
You know, the proposal would have real and damaging effects on the country and the National Park Service in particular. Reductions would be difficult for the National Park Service because as an organization, we rely heavily on staff. And with nearly 30% of Interior as full-time employees, it would require us to hiring freezes, deep cuts to seasonal employees in our parks, and furloughs and permanent employees, and we could lose as many as 5,000 FTEs from our workforce. Seeing significant impacts to parks operations, we would end up having to close visitor centers, reduce trash collection and facility cleaning, reduce ranger-led programs, and likely see delays in plowing operations and emergency response time. We'd reduce number of wildland firefighters across their fire bureaus, including the National Park Service. We have between 1,000 to 1,700 positions total. It would be very devastating to see nearly 30% of them just gone.
Thank you so much.
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. Chairman Simpson and I discussed this a little bit in his office as well. It's my understanding that the fiscal year 22 budget would also have to absorb increases elsewhere, so we could be seeing a 25% decrease in the Bureau's budget. And if that were to be the case, we simply would not be serving the American people, and we would be failing the future. You know, I hear often, because it's true, that business needs certainty. We're currently working on 68 renewable energy solar projects with 120 coming right behind them. We need people to get those projects analyzed to figure out if they're the right projects for the right places. Same goes with oil and gas permitting. We take a real, I think, hit to that program and the ability to deliver the certainty that is there now. I'm really concerned about what it would do to our fire work and the work we do to prevent fire from harming communities around our communities. The hazardous fuel reduction work, that takes people on the ground doing hard work. And finally, we have this remarkable opportunity under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act to do real meaningful restoration on our public lands that will help things like fire resilience. And we just won't be able to get that work done.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's on. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Pingree. The employees of the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife National Park Service, you're the guardians. You're the guardians and caretakers of our great national treasures, public lands, waters, natural cultural resources, and we thank you for your work. And I'm pleased to have worked along with Chair Pingree and others over the last few years to support the essential work that you do. So I'm going to ask each of you a question, but I'm going to do it in a rolling order. Director Sams, you mentioned what would happen to the backbone of the Park Service, its employees, but if you could give us a couple examples or some concerns you have about backlog and maintenance of facilities. Director Stone Manning, I'm concerned that the Bureau is still suffering from lost staff needed to implement its programs. Under the previous administration, BLM's headquarters was relocated from D.C. to Grand Junction, Colorado, without any input from Congress. It was a unilateral decision. This cost the Bureau 87% of its headquarters staff, and these are the people who prepare all the reports that we're asking for and that the public needs. It was 328 positions that were there. 287 did not relocate. Could you maybe tell you how that workforce replenishment is going and how that has contributed to some of the backlog that you have? And then, Ms. Williams, climate change and its effects on some of the infrastructure projects that we currently have. For example, the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge is increasingly seeing its trail system go underwater during parts of the year. And we're also seeing now in the upper Mississippi invasive carp. So could you tell me some of the things in your budget, not only for investing in conservation work for endangered species, but you know, do you have you're starting to develop, because of climate change, a backlog at Minnesota Valley National Refuge. I'm sure it's happening elsewhere where you now have new maintenance you have to do.
So I'll start. Thank you, Congresswoman. So first and foremost, you know, the budget balance is a continuing commitment to address the maintenance backlog. We have $22.3 billion in backlog. We have over 75,000 structures and pieces as a bureau. In addition to the $1.3 billion from GOA Legacy Restoration Fund, the budget proposes over $970 million to prevent or eliminate deferred maintenance from multiple sources, including line item construction, cyclic maintenance, Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act, and Federal Lands Transportation. If those funds were cut, we would be further put behind in being able to get those. And there's a big expectation from the American people that we make sure these investments are out there. But I can only do that with having the boots on the ground to carry out and implement the Great American Outdoors back in the LRF funding. And that's with the help of even our consultants and construction folks who are out helping us get those done. And so any major cut to that would further put us back in a deferred maintenance and only make this continue to grow for the American people.
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. I am committed to rebuilding the BLM into the robust agency that the American people deserve and that the future deserves and that our public lands deserve. And not only did we lose bodies, we lost hundreds of years of institutional knowledge, and that's going to take time to rebuild for all the obvious reasons. But when it comes to rebuilding, I'm starting sort of from the ground up. We've hired 60 HR people, for example, in the last couple years so that we can do the work we need to go get the people we need. We've got some leadership back in place, more coming. And we are taking this opportunity between the move, which had downstream effects because some people left state offices to move into the headquarters when it moved west. So those vacancies remain as well. We're taking advantage of this to say, what workforce do we need for the challenges ahead? So we're doing a workforce analysis. We're also putting together recruiting tools to get out onto our campuses to bring a crop of young Americans into public service.
Thank you, Representative McCollum. And you raised two very important issues for all of us, and that is climate change and climate's impact on our public lands, and then also invasive species. So for climate change, our budget request does include the capacity that I mentioned for our refuge staff to be able to build and rebuild. This infrastructure, it does require an all-of-government approach. There is a task force for the Department of the Interior. We are looking at climate across the board for the Fish and Wildlife Service, but then also very specifically, for example, for the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge. We also have specific money for invasive carp and working with partners and continuing those projects that are very important. And I would add for invasive species, we know how important it is to address invasive carp, but also early detection and rapid response is something that we are all paying attention to, because if we can prevent the invasive species, we can save that destruction, habitat destruction, losing businesses too, but also prevent the invasive species from taking hold. So thank you for asking those questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks all for being with us. Director Sams, I wanted to just direct a few questions for you, and obviously exciting to have a leader who's from the Northwest leading the Park Service, and I want to recognize the significance of you being the first tribal citizen to hold this role. As you know, during World War II, thousands of Japanese Americans across our country were forced from their homes as a consequence of an executive order that authorized the exclusion of Japanese Americans. That was a very dark chapter. Thousands of Japanese Americans from Washington State were incarcerated. In my district on Bainbridge Island, 227 Japanese Americans were forced to leave, boarding a ferry at Eagledale to begin a journey that would put them in internment camps for the duration of the war. A memorial, which is managed by the Park Service, is now located at that ferry dock, which is a way of commemorating that dark chapter. I want to thank you for including the Japanese American confinement sites grants in your written testimony. It's, I think, a critical program that supports that memorial and many sites around the country. I guess I wanted to just ask you to elaborate a bit on the progress made in establishing the competitive criteria and other specifications for that program. I'd love to get a sense of how the National Park Service intends to strengthen its work on preserving and interpreting those sites. There's a keen interest in providing more active visitor experience there on Bainbridge Island, and I would love to just hear how the committee can support that and you in these efforts.
Well, thank you, Representative Kilmer. So yes, it's an important part of our history, and looking back on it so we don't ever repeat that mistake again, especially to American citizens of any group or ethnicity in this country. We continue to work very closely with the Japanese American community, a number of folks from historical World War II, to ensure that the grants are competitive in your home state and in Bainbridge and Minidoka, also now in Amachi, and figuring out how we continue to preserve these places. In my own home state, of course, near the Oregon border, we also had one of the encampments. Being able to ensure that that the different voices are being heard. We're losing that generation very quickly, and so we are actively working to ensure that we get that money out the door so that we can capture those stories, and those stories can be told in full throat at these places that are so important to tell.
I also wanted to thank you for including the Historic Preservation Fund in your testimony. There's a number of tribes in the Northwest that have tribal historic preservation offices, TIPOs, that consult with federal agencies and others to protect and preserve and revitalize places of historical and cultural significance to tribes. Can you just say a word or two, Director Sams, about the importance of TIPOs for protecting these sites, and comment on how the Park Service ensures appropriate tribal consultation?
You know, I can speak from personal understanding and working very close with our own tribal historic preservation officer on the Umatilla Indian Reservation, in which we had to work very hard to get back the Kennewick man, or as we call him, the ancient one. And so that work that tribal historic preservation officers do, not just in my own home territory and your home territory, but across the nation, is critical in ordering to protect those who passed before us, the funerary objects and the things that have been taken away and put in museums and held in both public and private collection, and how tribes can go and reacquire those and work in partnership with those institutions if they wish to display them in such a way that would tell a much fuller story. And so ensuring that when we looked at the budget, we put those in there so that more tribal historic preservation officers each year we're able to expand that program, which is also part of the tribe's self-governance issues, and work in partnerships with states and state historic preservation officers.
Great. I see I'm on yellow. I got another question, but I'll wait till the next round, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Mr. Stewart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for all of you being here. I had to step out briefly to take a meeting. I wish I'd been here because apparently there was an unprovoked attack on my beautiful state by the chairman. I wish you'd been
Well,
here.
I'm sure that the National Park Service, Mr. Sams loves Utah. You got more national parks there than you
That's
do
true.
anywhere
That's
else in the
true.
country.
We're going to talk about that. So a couple things, if I could, Director. Good news and bad news. One is thanks for your help on wild horses. Again, the chairman mentioned that I've become, or at least I was known as being kind of a one-trick pony, if you will, no pun intended, on wild horses, because they became a very important issue in my state. The good news is we are making progress. We do need more gathers. I think we need more contraception for the gathered horses. We're worried about the cost of feed. Cost of hay is obviously much, much higher. We're worried that you'll back off on gathering because of that, and I wish you wouldn't, and we'll try and get you more money to cover the cost of the additional feed, because we can't give up the progress that we've made on this so far. So comments on that, if you would, just broadly, but if not, I'll move on.
Congressman, I couldn't agree. We've made 2 years of really solid progress with the numbers going down. But those are mouths that we need to feed when they're off the range. And the problem I'm facing is that it used to cost $4 per animal per day for the care and feeding of those horses, and now it's $7.
Yeah.
So we're going to need your help.
And we're aware of that. And once again, we just hope we can't stop gathering because of that. And again, I would encourage use of contraception because this is a lousy existence for these horses. I've got some of these corrals, these pastures, they call them in Utah, and you got hundreds and hundreds of horses all sitting in a room that seems to be about as big as this, and they're just standing there in the dust. It's a lousy life for them if they could. Thanking you for that. Now a concern, if I could. Grand Staircase, Escalante National Monument. The state is a cooperating agency in designing those plans. I know you know that. I would ask you if they were, but the answer is clearly they are. But they don't feel like they've been treated like a cooperating agency. And when we talk about the grazing rights and other things associated with that, I mean, that's enormously important to the local community. And the great fear is that they're going to be pushed aside and not considered. And I'd ask for your commitment that you'll include the state and the local communities who have a stake in this and have a legal and a moral right to be involved with the planning of these new management plans.
Congressman, the state is a cooperator, and I'd like to believe we work really closely with Utah. They've been a help to me in understanding the issues in your state, and we're in touch with them on everything from sage grouse to monuments to connectivity and more. So you have my commitment that we will continue to hear the voices of the state, and as we put that management plan together.
Well, and I appreciate that, and I'm noticing in your biography you talk about bipartisan legislation. You're proud of being bipartisan.
I am.
But there's a difference too between being heard and actually, because we can hear anything, but if you don't actually consider and then adjust plans according to their priorities. Now, I know that you can't allow the state to write these management plans. You can't allow the counties to write these management plans. But there's a difference just being heard and then feel like, well, they heard me, but then they ignored everything I said. And so I appreciate you being willing to listen to them, but I also ask you to take the next step, and that's try to accommodate some of their very legitimate concerns.
Congressman, I hear you, and I will. We need to marry the concerns of folks on the ground with what the proclamation asks us to do.
Thank you, and we're going to push on that, and then and we look forward to other conversations about that as well. Mr. Sams, thank you. I'm going to just very quickly, in the minute and 8 seconds, I think, as I can see, talking about visitor management plans in state parks, especially Zion National Park, which is one of my favorite places in the world to be. We want to keep and protect a good experience for people to go there. If they go to a national park, you don't want to feel like you just hung out at Walmart for the afternoon, walking through crowded aisles and surrounded by people. But on the other hand, if you implement some of the reservation plans and reduce the numbers, then you're essentially locking out people from their own backyard because people in Utah won't have access and others. And I would make the same point if I could, and again, I'll allow you to respond, but the state and the local counties are technically, statutorily, they are cooperating agencies. They get to have a say in this. And I'll just tell you, this is a very important issue to me, and we're going to push back really, really hard if they come up with numbers that we don't understand the science behind it, and if people in Utah feel like they're locked out of going into their own national parks.
Thank you, Congressman Stewart. So, yes, so last year I visited over 60 parks across the country and went both in low and high seasons, on the shoulders and on the high seasons, to really try to understand this. In your park, haven't gotten to yet, but visitation at Zion has grown from 2.7 million in 2010 to over 5 million in 2021. It's more than doubled in many places. The NPS is currently preparing the visitor use management plan and accompanying the environmental assessment for Zion National Park in cooperation with the state of Utah, in cooperation with the relevant county governments, the town of Springdale, and our partners at the Bureau of Land Management. And we are committed to that. But I also, and I look at this, I also agree with my staff that what might work at Zion may not work at Acadia. And so we're looking at this very closely to what the gateway communities want, what the state wants, to ensure that we recognize we're in somebody's backyard.
Okay, and thank you. We'll continue to talk with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Harder.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I have a special guest for our hearing. Director Williams, you might recognize my good friend, Nellie the Nutria. It's been a few years since she's appeared at a congressional hearing, but she was able to fit us into her tight schedule. Nellie the Nutria is a swamp rat, an invasive species. She can grow up to 40 pounds, eat a quarter of her body weight every single day. One female nutria can reproduce 200 offspring a year. These suckers grow exponentially. They're endemic in Louisiana, as you know well. And if we didn't take action in California, we were at a moment where we would have up to 500,000 of these swamp rats destroying our wetlands, damaging our almond trees, and causing havoc everywhere. This is one of the few issues in Congress where $1 saves us $10 or $100 by eradicating this invasive species. However, I was shocked and devastated and disappointed to see that the proposed budget that we're talking about today cuts the nutria eradication budget by almost 61%. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. She may look cute right here, but I can tell you she causes a lot of harm in the wetlands. What are you going to do to help us make sure that we can address this shortfall and ensure that she stays in a museum and not on an almond farm?
Congressman Harder, it's hard to know where to start with that. I'm somewhat delighted but not completely to be joined by Nellie the Nutria because she may be interesting here, but I do understand nutria create a serious problem. So it is a serious issue. An example is I went to the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge and have paid attention to eradicating nutria in the Delmarva Peninsula as an example of knowing that we can do it. It takes money and it takes partners and efforts, but we can do that. So it is very important that we continue our nutria eradication efforts across the country. As I said earlier, with other invasive species, early detection, rapid response is the way to go. But once they're there, we still are working very closely with APHIS, USDA, to address nutria. So we are putting money toward nutria. We are paying attention, and I agree it is a serious concern.
Thank you. I agree you're putting money, but you're putting 60% less, or planning to put 60% less towards it. Do you think that's going to be enough to fully eradicate nutria from California in the next 3 to 5 years, which was the plan under the bill that we passed unanimously just a few years ago in the House, the Senate, and was signed by the last president?
Congressman Harder, I look forward to getting back to you with more specifics, but it was my understanding it was more out of earmark and the timing of the budget coming out that it looked like we were cutting this and not spending the money set forth. So I will get back to you on exactly what we will do going forward, and I believe that was a matter of timing, not a matter of defunding this effort.
Terrific. I hope that's the case, and we would love to work with you to make sure that this effort is fully funded. These are an exponential problem, and if you go in Louisiana, you can't go 2 steps without one of these suckers. We don't want the same thing happening in California. They've been found in Illinois. Many other states are having nutria problems, and because they may look cute, but they do breed so quickly, 200 offspring every single year, if you let even one go off, it causes a problem of you have to pay millions of dollars more, where it could have cost you just a couple cents to get it right the first time. So we were thrilled to get this bill across the finish line, but it's not going to mean much if we're not going to be able to fully fund these eradication efforts. I've spent time putting on waders, going into the wetlands myself. I know it works. I know these eradication efforts are successful. Every single environmental advocate, every single farmer in our district is on board with this effort, and we want to make sure that this program is a huge success. And I want to thank the team that's on the ground. I just want to make sure that the team on the ground is fully funded to get this across the finish line for good.
Mr. Chair, Representative Harder, if I may, I would be delighted to go with you on the ground and with waders on and following the canines that also sniff out for nutria. So I would look forward to doing that.
We'd love to do it. My hope is by the time we get there, we don't find any,
They're not.
because we've been successful at eradicating this for sure. And Mr. Chair, you're always welcome to put on some waders and come out into our wetlands, and well, maybe you can even go dunk hunting. You can go dunk hunting as well. But no, these are actually, it's a pellet gun They actually, they capture one, they sterilize it, and then it's called the Judas Nutria Program. They release them back into the wild to sniff out the den and make sure we get them for good. So that's my understanding.
Often said that I'm not gonna go to Everglades till they get rid of those pythons.
Yeah.
Down there, 'cause, and those will swallow you alive. But I'll wait till you eradicate them.
There you go. That's fine.
Thanks for bringing your pet today. Mr. Amaday.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stone Manning, I want to congratulate you first for when they had a pick between wild horses and those things, you picked wild horses, and I think you did the right thing. No offense to Mr. Harder. We had first pick, and we made it last for once. I won't go into whether the Utah thing was unprovoked, although I do find it interesting that somebody from the Beehive State is talking about contraception, and I'll let it go at that. But Director Williams, it has historically been Fish and Wildlife's position that, for instance, on the Sheldon National Antelope Range, that wild horses are inconsistent with, and cows too, let's be fair, are inconsistent with the goals of the service in areas like that, especially when you're talking about sage hen, which is what some of us lesser educated people refer to the sage grouse as. And so can you just tell me briefly, what's Fish and Wildlife doing to cooperate with BLM on wild horses?
Mr. Chair.
I'm trying to start a little fight here in case anybody, so go right ahead.
Mr. Chair and Congressman Amaday, well, I would say if you want to start a little fight, I'm very proud of the work that we all do together, including sorting through some very difficult issues that have been around for a long time. I believe this is one.
And I appreciate that. And so I'll follow up with you, not during the committee meeting, to talk about how there can be more collaboration. Don't think you're off the hook, Mr. Sams. Employee housing is something that you mentioned, and it's like you're way ahead of the folks down here in the BLM in terms of employee housing. So I would just like to ask you if you would share with the folks over at the Bureau how you have, and I know it's a long history, but you've got a long history and there are reasons for it, but if there are lessons to be learned, we dearly need to know how we basically can hire GS 6 through 9s at the present rates and make it affordable for them to live in the communities we ask them to work in, because it ain't right now. So I'll appreciate following up that with whoever the appropriate folks are on your staff. Also, I was pleased to hear you talk about Indian tourism and stuff like that, and I am looking forward to being able to work with you guys. The American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association, which is a federal entity, is looking for a home. And the home they're looking for is on the old Stewart Indian School complex in western Nevada. We're going to need some help with Ms. Stone Manning's folks on saying, here, state, give us this part of this campus, not a big part, and so here's how we're going to make the pot right for the state. But would really appreciate Parks' support in that when we go to the folks in Nevada and say, you need to do this swap so that these folks have a permanent home. So I look forward to talking with you about that, if that's okay. Ms. Williams, I want to visit with your folks in Sacramento and also in Nevada, and when you're done with those waders in the San Joaquin Valley, come on over to what used to be a fairly dry area. I want to have a better understanding of transparency in your operation. And it's not because, I'm just saying, it seems like a lot of stuff in the last couple of years has been kind of a surprise. This has come out of nowhere, and it's something that's going on. And I'll tell you the biggest one, and this hearing isn't long enough for it, thankfully, but when I've got BLM people in the Carson District Office looking at a geothermal project that they have gone quite a ways through the process, and it's not like, I'm proud of our BLM employees. They got a huge job. They own more than 80% of the state, not all BLM. But you know what? They've got good leadership. They do a good job. Sometimes they make a mistake. When they do, they own it and they move on. So there's my shout out to your folks, Madam Director. But when those folks are doing their thing, and it's like for the first time in 9 years, we have an emergency listing for the Dixie Valley toad. And it's like, I don't know whether that's right or wrong. It's just a big surprise to me when Fish and Wildlife and BLM, one's going north and one's going south. So I want to understand how that happened better, not in terms of whether it should or shouldn't have been listed, but how your process works where somebody enters your jurisdiction and gets, for the first time in 9 years, I would imagine it's a pretty compelling story, but at the same time, I'm like, well, what did they miss in that district office, in that field office? So I look forward to contacting you and getting together to set that up, and we will not ask you to put waiters on anything.
Congressman Amedee, I would look forward to that, and I can assure you we are always trying to coordinate the best we can so there aren't surprises and there should be transparency. So I'd be happy to follow up.
Good. Finally, thank you for stopping by my office. I look forward to following up on that. No editorial comments on you have somebody on your staff who graduated from Valley High School in Las Vegas. We'll forgive that. A great product of public education, and thank you for being here today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and believe me, I recognize how difficult at times the job is, and I commend you for taking the job. So this is one of my favorite pictures. Inscribed in stone above the Yellowstone Arch, the Teddy Roosevelt Arch is, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. It's in the Enabling Act. I looked. Mr. Director, do you also believe in this?
Thank you, Congressman Ziki. Absolutely.
All
These
right.
are America's treasures, and all
All right.
Americans should be able to
All
enjoy
right.
them.
So this is what I hear around my district. Glacier Park, rationing. You talked about coordination. State wasn't coordinated with. County wasn't coordinated with. Great Falls wasn't coordinated. And Mr. Chairman, I have a statement from Great Falls, Montana, about Glacier National Park. And I get it. The population's up, but I also get that over 90% is wilderness. So you're limited on how you can manage inside the boundaries. I get there's a lot of traffic, and you know, the Great American Outdoors Act gave you the funds to fix. When I came in, two great things. We have a problem with infrastructure. Number one problem across the parks, across our forests, was infrastructure. Great American Outdoors Act solved that. As long as the money goes to infrastructure and not studies, I think we'll be in pretty good shape. But part of the infrastructure is we've got to figure out a transportation system inside the park, because those families that grew up, have lived like myself around and in Glacier Park, were boxed out. And I appreciate that it went to 3 o'clock. If you would look, sir, and maybe moving it to 1, because the issue is, at least it gives an opportunity for people to, when they got the kids, to run to the park, do the hike, and come back before it gets dark. And in the morning, the reservation system, everyone's running for a parking spot. And a lot of locals will double up, triple up, and a lot of locals will go a little further in because they know where to go in. So I urge you to do that. So a bus system, I'm sure there's other parks that do bus systems. Could be EV, could be whatever, but we need to manage the people and manage our parks better. Would you agree?
Congressman Ziki, absolutely, and thanks for touring with me a couple weeks ago over at the Lincoln. Yes, and our conversation was about EV and other buses. I agree with you 100%. We've got to figure this out. And of course, at Glacier, because of some of those limitations, we are putting the money forward to figure out and tackle that. We have some of our best social scientists looking at how we can better time those entries in, because denying people who have traveled a long way to get there is just not working.
If you don't hook a kid, by the statistics were compelling, if you don't hook a young adult by 14 or so, they don't develop the deep love for the land. They might get it out of statistics, a little later, but in order to hook them hard, statistically, you got to have an experience when you're younger in the parks. And the parks, for the degree, this is why, to the degree we have them. So I look forward to working with you, but UOFA, we've talked about it. On the record, we're very sensitive about it. If you look at one, that'd be a big help. And we'll work you through, along this committee, how to look at a longer term plan. Grizzly bears. Boy, when I was secretary, we looked at the grizzly bears. And in 2005, then the director we're talking about the greater Yellowstone grizzly. I think the argument on the greater Yellowstone grizzly, the research is compelling. The species has recovered. It has brilliantly recovered. I think we should celebrate and bring those resources to other species that are challenged. Does your Directory still support the 2005 study that says the grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have recovered and should be a candidate to remove from the list?
Mr. Chair and Congressman Zinke, the Fish and Wildlife Service recently, or in 2021, completed a 5-year review of the status of grizzly bears. Then also last year, we received petitions from the states of Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho to delist grizzly bears. And we issued positive findings for the Montana and Wyoming petitions, which then trigger the next step under the Endangered Species Act, which is a status review that would be the next step toward delisting.
And you know, also, Congress has the authority. So there's a little bill floating around that can take that track, and Congress has a bill within House Resources to compel you. To understand you're going to have lawsuits and stuff like that, but if you commit to work with us on it, because I think we're going in the same direction.
Mr. Chair and Congressman Zinke, I'm aware of those bills and understand there was a hearing last week at which my deputy director testified on those bills. And yes, I was the director of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks when those previous bills went through. I'm very aware of this issue, care very much about grizzly bears and their impacts on the people who live on the ground.
I know you have experience, and thank you. Finally, Director Manning, good to see you. So what percentage of BLM managed property is in Washington, D.C.? Other than a desk, perhaps?
Our closest facility is at Meadowood.
And not
which
very
is in
much.
Virginia.
What would you think the percentage is? Let's say west of the Mississippi, let's say out west. What do you think the percentage is?
Congressman, as I like to say, the vast majority of our holdings
I
that
think
we're
the vast
responsible for,
majority would be an understatement.
as is
on
our
that.
staff. Over 97% of our staff are in the West.
So when we did move, well, I ask you this, what's the mission of BLM? Is it to, I'll give you multiple choice, is it to preserve the health, diversity, and the future of our lands that are under your charge, or is it to deliver reports to Congress? Exactly.
Congressman, we have a beautiful mission to sustain the health and productivity of our public lands, and that requires...
I'm reading a mission, and you know what? It doesn't say report to Congress, deliver reports to Congress at all. It says do your work. And I think, Madam, your work is out in the West.
Congressman, with due respect, my work is sitting across the table from you.
Today it is.
And in order to serve the people who are doing the real work, right? We, at the headquarters, we serve the people on the ground. And in order to do that work and serve them well, the Secretary believes, as I believe, that we need leadership here to work with our colleagues. When the Dixie Valley toad pops
So
up, we
is there a
can work
reason
together.
why they only had 200 and some people want to come back from the West? Could it be perhaps that we did do a study and look at quality of life? Because they're trying to hire an E or a GS 6 or 7. I can tell you from experience, DC is a little rough. You know, and a lot of the young people that want to work for the BLM or our Park Service, they don't want to work in DC. You know where they want to work? In the field. It's amazing the U.S. Geological Survey loves to do science in the field. Park rangers love to do science in the field. BLM loves the great outdoor spaces.
So having said that, so also Secretary Holland said there was 20 mines that were permitted.
Do you know how many mines of those that are on 20 were gravel pits?
Congressman, it's my understanding that it was 20 mines that were either permitted or expanded. As
Permitted and expanded, or expanded?
permitted, modified,
Okay,
or,
she said permitted, okay.
permitted,
expanded.
modified, or expanded.
You
And
know how many were gravel pits?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll get it to you.
Because gravel pit would be a part of that. You're in charge of gravel pits as
I
well,
know I
right?
am, yeah.
indeed. Okay.
Well, I'm not. I mean, the people on the ground are.
Well, see,
but-
out there.
But I think it's very important to impart that we are committed the president is committed to mining for the critical minerals that are going to be necessary for the energy transition in this country.
Are
And
you aware it'll take 2,000% increase in 20 years to catch up on where we are today in critical minerals?
Well, that's why I'm so happy.
Are you aware of that?
That particular statistic, I wasn't. I
Are
know
are
that
you aware that China owns 62% of the critical minerals necessary for EV?
I heard that. I heard that from you yesterday. What I am really pleased about is that we're beginning to solve the problem. Earlier this month, we issued a notice to proceed for the Thacker Pass mine. When it's up and running, it'll produce 20% of the lithium that this nation needs. Coming right on its heel, we're working really hard on the Rhyolite Ridge project. We are taking seriously the president's
Could you give me a
call to
list
provide these minerals.
of the 20? And last question really
will.
quick. Bison always comes up. Boy, it comes up. Hot topic in Montana.
Yes.
And you had said that your department wants to work with local communities, state, because it's such and I think by law it's a coordinating authority. But the secretary issued this order 3410, restoration of bison on prairie grasslands. And what's interesting is the state of Montana is excluded from that. The state is. Do you support excluding Montana from the state's discussion of bison, Montana, or was that an oversight and we need to correct it and probably have stock growers and some stakeholders in there that this adversely might affect?
Congressman, it's my understanding that any reintroduction of bison to the wild.
But should the state have a say?
Well, any reintroduction of wild bison to the landscape would go through a NEPA process, and of course, the state would be a cooperator in that.
Well, here's a secretary order mandating restoration of bison in the prairie lands. It's a group, right? It's a group that gives an advice. Don't you think the states should be a part of that group?
I believe that she was directing the federal family to work together to bring these ideas to the public.
She had latitude. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Let me ask you a couple questions I've got going here. Director Williams, this takes a introduction before the question. Approximately 360 million acres, or nearly 70% of working forests in the U.S. are on private land, and access to these private forests is vital for wildlife conservation, given over 60% of at-risk species rely on privately owned forest lands. Collaboration between private forest owners and state and federal agencies has proven to drive conservation outcomes, often precluding the need for regulatory actions and aiding in species recovery efforts. Proactive, collaborative conservation efforts produce win-win outcomes for at-risk and listed species, for regulatory and conservation communities, and for private landowners, private forest owners. For example, one example of a highly successful collaborative between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, states, and private forest owners is the Wildlife Conservation Initiative, carried out by the National Alliance for Forest Owners and its many federal, state, and local partners. The WCI relies on modern sustainable forest management, the sustainable cycle of growth, harvest, and regrowth to provide habitat for at-risk listed and other rare species. Could you tell me a little bit more about how the Wildlife Conservation Initiative is helping utilize collaborative conservation to help conserve wildlife on private lands to prevent regulatory action?
Yes, Chairman Simpson, I am incredibly grateful and proud of our work with Mr. Tenney and Mr. Bullock, specifically from the National Alliance of Forest Owners, also the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement. They have been absolute leaders in collaborative conservation, and I learn from them every day. Just last week, I was in St. Louis, Missouri, celebrating signing an MOU with NAFO and to put in place this wildlife conservation initiative. And we did that at the North American Conference on Wildlife Conservation with all of the other state agencies across the country. So they are leaders, and we have worked well with them over the years in developing these collaborative approaches, which I think are the future of conservation. So I'm pleased you asked.
I appreciate that comment, and I think you're right, and that's one of the reasons, frankly, that I've put no listing of sage grouse in several bills. Not because I don't care about sage grouse, but right now we've got the states, we've got private landowners, we've got the federal government working together. And as soon as you list it, And I understand that there are, sometimes you have to list the species, but as soon as you list sage grouse, all of a sudden the private landowners are going, I'm out of here. You won't get my cooperation anymore. So as long as we can keep the states and the private landowners and the federal government working together to preserve sage grouse habitat, I think we'll get further ahead. I will give you another example. There's an organization called the Peregrine Fund in Idaho. It works out of the birds of prey area out there. If you've never been out there, you need to go look at it. It's amazing, the birds that they help recover. And they help recover them not through litigation, not through Endangered Species Act, by working privately with organizations. And when I talked to them, they said the biggest danger to bird populations is lead shot or lead bullets to deer and stuff, because then they eat the deer and lead gets in them, that kind of stuff. And I said, so are you pushing legislation to ban lead bullets, lead shot? And they said, no. Said, we don't push that kind of stuff. We find we have much greater success going to the hunting organizations and talking to people, showing them what the effect is and stuff. We have much greater effect doing that and much greater cooperation than we would if we tried to mandate steel shot and stuff. So it's I think a way in the future how we can better manage for some of these listed and endangered species. You mentioned that it's the 50th year of the Endangered Species Act. When was the last time it was reauthorized?
Mr. Chair, I don't know that. All I know, I'm embarrassed that I don't know that because I have been a longtime student and teacher of wildlife law, so I don't know the answer to that.
I think it's been like 30, 35 years now.
I think you were a freshman, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. It was literally, I brought a bill down, an interior bill, when I was chairman before. So that was like 9 years ago or so, 7 or 8 years ago. And I brought it down with the chairman of the Resources Committee at the time, Doc Hastings from Washington. It defunded or put no funding in for endangered species or critical habitat management because we were trying to make a point. It had been, at that time, it had been 23 years since the Endangered Species Act had been reauthorized. And we knew that there would be an amendment, put the money in, that's okay. We expected that, you know. If not, we would have put it in conference. But we were trying to make the point that the authorizing committees need to do their job. And even at the time, Secretary Salazar told me there are some changes that need to be made to the Endangered Species Act. We have changes. You write a bill, you put it before the committee and let amendments be offered and all that kind of stuff. That's how you do reauthorizations. But it's not the new stuff that you get all the credit for and everything. And so consequently, what you've got, and I don't know how it's going to work this year, but you've got a bill that much, in fact, all of the 12 bills, you could go through them, many of the programs in there are not authorized, or the authorization has expired. We technically are not supposed to fund anything that is not authorized. So what if you do, and traditionally they waive that rule when they do a rule and bring it to the floor. What are you going to do if the Rules Committee says, no, we're not going to waive that provision? I mean, the whole State Department, I think, is unauthorized. Or expired, is a better way to say it. Most senior programs.
Department of Energy.
Yeah, Department of, I mean, it's authorizations just expire. And the reason you put them in is so that you will review them to see how they're working and see if changes need to be made. But we don't do that. And that's a challenge, I think, for both Republicans and Democrats, because over time, there are things that you could do better if you'd take the time to look at it. What you and Congressman Zinke were talking about you and I talked about in my office, we love our national parks to death. We get so many visitors, and I understand that. I love our national parks. But the transportation in these, you know, when I was first elected to Congress, the big conflict was at Yellowstone and snow machines. And literally, you would go to the Westgate And before they would open up, there would be a blue haze. Literally, it was amazing. Probably shouldn't have been breathing it, but there were so many private snow machines that went in there. And it was very, very controversial when they came up with the plan to have guided snow machines. They have to be certain types that don't emit as much exhaust. And then they've done a lot of the tour buses, however they do that with snow machines and stuff. But it's worked out great since then. But West Yellowstone community was, you're going to destroy our economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Change is hard. And in some of these parks, we've got to find a better way to do it. Yosemite is you send all these cars down there emitting exhaust and stuff. Yes, there still are exhaust cars on the road, but emitting all the exhaust and stuff that goes through. Normally, if you go through Yellowstone Park late at night or late October, you can drive through it in pretty quick time. You go through it in the middle of June. You'll be lucky. You better have a sleeping bag with you to get from one side of the park to the other because there's so many people. And as that says, it's for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, and that's why we need to maintain it in its current state so that people in future generations can enjoy it. But that's going to take some tough decisions and some really hard talking with local communities and other things to actually get it done. But I appreciate the job that you do, and with all of you. I have a couple other questions that we'll submit for the record, so that on the Great American Outdoors Act and how we're using it, and how we're going to address the backlog, and also on the August 21, BLM issued a federal registry notice announcing that it would reinitiate consideration of whether 10 million acre mineral withdrawal to conserve priority sage-grouse habitat is necessary. So we'll submit these for the record so that you can give us a written statement on that if you don't mind, okay? Ms. Pingree?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and really also for this conversation about our national parks, and we do love them to death. That's a good point. And when we get you to visit Acadia, you'll see that might be we're looking forward to it, and it might be the most visited park on the East Coast anyway, in a very small land area, particularly when you compare it to your western parts.
Smoky Mountain.
Oh, so close. We were so close to being first. But I have to say, they've done some interesting innovation in trying to, just the pathway to get it to the top of Cadillac Mountain, which is what everybody wants to do, was so lined with cars. Then the tour buses would try to get up there. It was just a nightmare, and it ruined really the visitor experience, and they've done a great job thinking about parking and same thing, visitor buses bringing people in. It's not easy. Nobody likes the change, but I appreciate the work that's going on at the national parks, and I know you'll continue to do more about managing the visitor experience. And I was really pleased to hear you, Director Sams, talk a little bit about the importance of housing. That's a big issue. I know they're dealing with that all the time in the National Park Service in our state. But I just wanted to have you reiterate a little bit. You and I got a chance to talk about this briefly, but the National Park Service policy to strengthen tribal co-stewardship and help park managers facilitate and support working relationships with tribes. And you mentioned one perhaps that was going on with the Wabanaki Nation on sweetgrass. You want to just elaborate? I know you talked about some of the TPO things, but just the work that's going on. I think that's such a good thing, and I appreciate your emphasis on that.
Thank you, Ranking Member Pingree. So yes, I spent 30 years outside the organization, mostly throwing rocks at the Department of Interior. So on the inside, I'm trying to be a little more careful. That being said, is really fulfilling our trust responsibility. The Biden-Harris administration and the Secretary are very serious about that, and we're seeing more engagement with tribes. We currently have 35 agreements with tribes across the country in 35 different parks in which we're doing a myriad of things, everything from plant propagation at Acadia, working with the Wabanaki tribe and using their traditional knowledge and being able to do the rotation of the plants in a way that will be sustainable, and also adapting to the climate change that we are seeing in the park. everything to working with 11 tribes out in Grand Canyon, and everything from economic development, looking at how we're doing concessions with them, to how are we doing in restoring water in the Colorado Basin, how is that water being shared, and how can we work in partnership to ensure the water's there in order to support the fish and other aquatic wildlife and the sedge areas along the way. And so these programs that we're doing, and since the secretarial order followed by a director's memoranda really outlining that trust responsibility, what I'm most excited about is seeing our younger staff really grabbing onto that and wanting to figure out how to work more closely with tribes across, not just telling their story, but to actually truly partner with them. We know that the sophistication of some tribes is very advanced, and some are needing some help with that. That's why we're putting in that request to help them get to where they need to be, so that their knowledge is being put into the ground to help us to sustain these places that have been here since time immemorial, and those future generations will also get a chance to enjoy them.
That's great. Well, I look forward to following your work on that. A couple other quick questions. Director Williams, the budget proposes an increase for e-permitting and to move it from international affairs to a new budget line. Just curious about why the change is needed and how will the increased funding requested be used?
Thank you for asking that. Ranking Member Pingree, the e-permitting system, because it delivers the same function, I think it's much more effective and makes more sense to have it all be under one place. And it is, I think it has been successful, but not fully staffed. And so I think we can build it out with better software and with better capacity. So
Great.
I
Thank
think
you.
it's an exciting opportunity for us.
Good. And we'll look forward to having you come to Maine as well when we can. And you're all welcome, of course. And I think you were just there last summer, so come back. And Director Stone Manning, the budget prioritizes increasing renewable energy projects, and you were addressing some of that in the member questions. I'm just curious if you want to talk a little bit more about how to accelerate the permitting or what you're doing. You talked about the number of solar projects that need to be permitted and come online. So how are you accomplishing that? Is that just a staffing issue, or is there more to it?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. It is a staffing issue mostly, and a time issue. There's a bit of a rush on our public lands for renewable energy development. I'm really pleased that we permitted 8.5 gigawatts in the last 2 years. There are 68 projects that we're working on now. There are 5 major transmission lines that we're working on to get that power to the people who need it. And then there are roughly 120 projects waiting to come in behind that. And what that requires is people. And so I'm working hard. That's all part of the rebuilding of the Bureau, and I'm working hard to try and build that up. And as Director Sams noted, there are some challenges. The West has been discovered, and it's an expensive place to live in now. So we're working closely at figuring out everything from retention bonuses to recruitment bonuses to housing, and figuring out if there's a way that we can do an all-of-government approach to help solve this problem so that people can stay in public service and deliver these kinds of projects on the ground.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Parks. I hate to say that when I was secretary, it seems like a long time ago. We looked at taking the red bus of Glacier and redoing it, because if you're going to have transportation within the park system, it has to be enriching rather than driving around with a school bus, right? And you want the transportation to have an experience that again is enriching the experience of the park. So we looked at red buses because they were cool, but upgrade them, to some transportation. We looked at maybe Tesla doing a drivetrain, and then some cars, so you could expand or contract according to the need and time of year and all that kind of stuff. The Great Northern, or the Great American Outdoors Act, had provisions in there to begin to look at prototypes, testing, those type of things. Are you involved in that?
Thank you, Congressman Ziggy. Yes, we've been looking at different types of EVs, different types of transportation, looking at everything from the red buses to the yellow buses, and how can we retrofit them in a way to provide that enhanced visitors experience. One that, dates back to 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and figuring out how new technology can be retrofitted in those so that we can use it and give a visitor experience. We are definitely.
I'd be interested in swinging by sometime and talk to your staff, just out of interest where you sit on it. So critical minerals, boy, it seems to be on the discussion of everyone's lips. So it's the way I look at it, I'm all the above, but it has to be affordable, reliable, and abundant. So EV world, we know that Russia, China, and perhaps our adversaries have the market share of the materials, whether it's lithium, whether it's cobalt. We have problems in the supply chain about children mining cobalt. And it is true that children are mining cobalt and are thirst. So we have a supply chain about how much. And the statistic I heard, and I think it came from the U.S. Geological Survey, as a matter of fact, it would take about 2,000% increase over 20 years just to reach where we are today. So we have the supply chain, and even if you get a permit in lithium at 30%, it's not enough, what the demand is. And then the other side of it is, what do you do when a battery's life cycle is done? What do we do with this? Right now, 90% of solar cells are being dumped in landfills. And solar cells primarily are being sourced from China. The chips and the technology and components are primarily being sourced to China. And it seems at the moment we are trading a dependence on fossil fuels to a greater vulnerability and dependence on China. And it is very concerning for me, both on the military side, but also the EV. We're blindly going on a cliff, and we haven't quite figured out what we're going to do with the batteries. And some of us are old enough to remember the nuclear program. Just when we decided we would invest in Yucca, I think the chairman was saying about 12 or 14 billion over 10 years, and just when we decided we're going to turn it on, something happens, and now we have distributed storage of nuclear material at some 128 sites across the country. So is there a plan that you know of what are we going to do? And are we going to put the toxins on federal land? Or what are we going to do? Because right now we can't even get rid of the windmill blades. We're struggling to find a hole deep enough for it. And oh, by the way, wind does kill a lot of birds. Would you agree it's at least 750,000 a year, and at least 1,200 raptors of eagles and all that in there? So you do recognize that wind and everything has a cost, right?
Everything we do as humans has a cost. I
So,
agree with
so what's the plan? Because I love plans. Is there a plan for a national repository for this material, or are we just pushing it and we'll try to figure it out when we get there?
Congressman, thanks for the question. And we've learned from the mistakes of the past, right? We've got $4.7 billion from the bipartisan infrastructure law to go clean up orphaned oil and gas wells that are across our landscape, and that won't be enough to get the whole job done. So I'm interested in what this body can do to help chart a cleaner future for our country. The president is very clear.
Is there a plan right now? Is there a plan on what to do with the toxins and the batteries, or is it developing?
Congressman, I think that we would have to ask the Department of Energy that question. It's out of the BLM's purview, but I'd be happy to get you in touch with the right
BLM
folks.
could very well get saddled with it, right? And I assume it's a government agency, and I assume the CEQ is aware of this. I assume you guys, the body talks. So the bottom line is you don't know of any plan at the moment. We would have to talk to the Department of Energy or someone in the CEQ.
Because it's out of the BLM purview, I'm not aware of a plan, but I do have.
You're just part of just to build it, and they're going to deal with it some other time.
And I do have great faith in the American people to learn from the mistakes of the past.
Let's make sure we don't repeat them again. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Director Williams, since everyone else has invited you into hip waders, I feel like I should do the same. I went out this summer with a group hoping not to find European green crab in the Puget Sound, and unfortunately, we were successful in finding them, which on one hand, I was glad to see what one looked like, and on the downside, there were a whole bunch of them in a place they're not supposed to be. They are consuming microalgae and clams and oysters, and a real threat to tribal treaty rights, a real threat to our shellfish industry, a real threat to other native species, and like all of these other invasive species, they're growing like gangbusters and have exponential growth. Our governor, Governor Inslee, did an emergency order last year. Just want to get a sense of what Fish and Wildlife is doing to minimize the spread and the destruction of the European green crab, and how can this committee help?
Thank you for asking that question, Congressman Kilmer. And yes, I share the concerns about European green crab and controlling their impacts. At the moment, NOAA is the primary agency over green crab, but that does not mean the Fish and Wildlife Service is abdicating responsibility and engagement in any way. We're very much a part of the groups, the stakeholders responding. And we, too, are contributing to a draft national control plan that should be out by the end of April. So that's soon. And we've been working hand in hand with NOAA and the state, as you say, to address green crab. But I wish I had an answer. Like so many invasive species, once they have taken hold, it's really hard to eradicate them. So we are also taking on-the-ground actions for ourselves as well. I mean, using our own money, including, because of the impact to tribal treaty rights, we recognize that. We have provided $82,000 to the Makah tribe, and I know we also have been working with USGS in trying to fund a way to have early detection so that we can detect them before they spread farther than they are. But we share concerns with you on this issue and are doing everything we can in concert with our partners.
Great, I'm eager to help, and certainly as the action plan rolls out, we'd love to get a brief from you or NOAA.
Happy to do that.
Great, thanks, Mr. Chair, you'll back.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. We got through a whole hearing without talking about quagga mussels. Just had to throw that term out there. Something we're trying to keep out of Idaho and the Pacific Northwest and that kind of stuff. It was interesting that a couple of years ago, they have the wash stations for the boats. Found quagga mussels on one of them. Happened to be a Fish and Wildlife Service boat that was coming in. But I mean, these wash stations do a good job. The other thing I would just notice, that you mentioned the 25 gigawatts of power that our goal is by when?
2025.
2025. And sometimes I get the idea, we talk so much about this, that wind and solar and battery power is going to be our future. That's not going to cover the energy necessary in this country, and it's intermittent energy. What you've got to have is firm power, so that when you turn on your light goes on. And you can ramp it up and down as the need is required. I find it interesting that in this and other budgets, in the administration's proposal, they want to increase funding for wind and all that kind of stuff, and solar and everything else. But when you look at the budget, they decreased by about $300 million NE, nuclear energy. If you're ever going to get to zero carbon, nuclear energy is an essential part of it. So I just find that interesting in the whole administration. I know that's not part of your bailiwick, so just thought I'd bring that up while we were talking about wind and solar. But again, thank you for being here today. We look forward to working with you over the coming months as we try to put together a budget and see where we end up. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member.
Committee stands adjourned.